Cowboy finds three Apache women bathing in the creek instead of running away from him. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The sun sat high above the Wyoming foothills in the slow, heavy way it did every summer afternoon in 1879, and Grant McCallan followed the narrow creek with careful, steady steps as he checked the fence line that always seemed to break after a strong night wind, his boots sinking slightly into the damp ground where the water curved close to the trees. He carried himself the same way he had since he buried his sister 2 years earlier, shoulders squared, jaw tight, movements even, his silence a habit he didn't bother trying to break anymore. The land around him stayed quiet except for the ripple of the creek and the soft scrape of branches brushing against the worn fabric of his shirt as he pushed through the brush. He stopped when he heard something that didn't belong to cattle, wind, or birds. A soft splash, followed by a quiet burst of laughter. Light unfamiliar, the kind that made him stiffen because he hadn't heard joy that close in a long time. Grant stepped forward with slow caution, not wanting to startle whoever it was, and he eased a branch aside with the back of his hand, careful not to snap it. The side on the other side froze him in place. Three young Apache women stood knee-deep in the shallow bend of the creek, water sliding around their legs as they washed dirt and sweat from their skin. Their hair hung long and heavy with water, the strands dark against their bronze shoulders. Their deerskin dresses draped over nearby rocks, damp from washing, and the soft breeze caught the beadwork along the edges, making the small colored pieces click faintly. The women saw him in the same second he saw them. All movement stopped. Their eyes sharpened, bodies tensing as if waiting for the worst. Grant lifted both hands slightly, palms open, and stepped back from the clearing without saying a word. His fingers stayed nowhere near the revolver resting loosely on his hip. He kept his gaze fixed on the dirt in front of him, making sure none of them mistook his presence for anything else. One woman stepped out of the water slowly, water trailing down her legs as she reached for the deerskin top on the rock. She pressed it to her chest, her breathing uneven, but she didn't run. This woman, Saya, though he didn't know her name yet, had a torn dress that no longer covered her the way it once had. The front had ripped low across the chest during whatever they'd survived, leaving a deep, visible line of cleavage that she tried to shield with her arm. Her curves were full and striking, hips that held her strength, a chest that strained against the wet, clinging fabric, and legs marked by scratches from running through the woods. Grant didn't look directly at the torn part of her dress. He kept his focus steady and respectful, anchoring his attention on the ground between them, so she would know he meant no harm. "We don't want trouble," she said in cautious, accented English, her voice tight from fear and exhaustion. "Neither do I," Grant answered quietly, his tone low and even, the same tone he used with frightened horses. "I'm just checking my fence." She studied him, searching for something in his expression. Her companion stayed close behind her, watching every breath he took. "You came alone?" she asked. "Yes." She nodded once, though her shoulders stayed tense. Grant reached into his saddlebag with slow, deliberate movements and pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle. He placed it on a flat rock halfway between them, then stepped back again. The women didn't move at first. Then Saya approached, eyes locked on him until she reached the bundle and lifted the cloth. Inside was bread he had packed that morning. She broke off a piece, handed some to the others, and when she looked back at him, something in her stance had shifted. There was still worry in her eyes, but the sharp edge of fear had eased. "What is your name?" she asked. "Grant McCallan." She touched her torn neckline again, trying to hold the fabric together, though the damp leather clung low anyway. "I am Saya." The name settled between them like something fragile. Grant dipped his head slightly in acknowledgement. Saya glanced at his hands, noticing how he kept them still, how he never reached toward his weapon, how he didn't try to come closer even though she stood only a few feet away now. "You saw us," she said softly, almost as if testing him. "I'll forget it if you want me to." Her breath caught. She hadn't expected that. Men she'd known before took advantage, not steps backward. "We were not Bathing for comfort, Saya said, her voice tightening again. Our camp was attacked. We ran into the woods. My sister was taken. Grant didn't push for more. I'm sorry. She looked down at the wet fabric of her dress, then back up at him. We have nothing left. You could take blankets, Grant said, nodding toward his horse. And more bread. Saya exchanged a glance with the other women. She approached slowly as Grant lifted the items from his saddle, setting them on the ground so she could take them without stepping close enough to feel cornered. When she picked up the blanket, her fingers brushed the edge of his hand for a brief second. The contact startled her, but she didn't pull away. Grant held still, steady, giving her space to decide if she wanted distance or closeness. When she finally stepped back, she clutched the blanket to her chest and swallowed hard. Her voice softened. You helped us without asking anything, she said. You looked like you needed it. The quiet stretched long and steady. The water moved behind them. The sun dropped lower, and Saya's companions gathered closer with their things. Before they turned to leave, Saya looked at Grant one last time, her eyes lingering on his steady posture, his sun-browned face, the careful restraint in every movement. You are different from the men we ran from, she said softly. I'm just trying to do right. She nodded once, then stepped away with the others, their bare feet leaving damp prints on the rocks until the trees swallowed the last edge of their silhouettes. Grant stayed by the creek long after they disappeared, the sound of water steady beside him. For the first time in years, the silence around him didn't feel quite the same. The moment had changed something in him, even if he couldn't name it yet. And as he walked back toward the fence line, he knew that whatever path he followed next wasn't going to be the same as the one he'd walked alone for so long. Grant followed the fence line until the sky dimmed into a steady pale blue that came before dusk settled over the foothills, and he worked with the same slow rhythm he used every evening, tying wire and checking posts, though his mind kept slipping back to the creek bend where the Apache women had stood with water on their skin and fear in their eyes. He had meant to leave the memory behind the second he stepped away, but the quiet that usually steadied him felt unsettled now, filled with the weight of something unfinished. His boots scraped across the dry ground as he walked toward his cabin, and the familiar outline of the small building came into view, leaning slightly from years of wind but still holding firm. Smoke drifted thin from the chimney. He hadn't lit a fire yet. That meant someone else had. He slowed immediately. Grant never rushed into anything, but his steps became shorter, more deliberate, his hand hovering near his holster without resting on it. When he reached the edge of the yard, he noticed small, bare footprints at the doorway. 3 sets slightly different in size, toes pressed deep into the dirt from fast walking. They had come here, the same women. He hadn't expected that. He hadn't expected them to trust him. He hadn't expected them to choose him over the forest. He stepped inside with controlled movement, pushing the door open slowly so the hinges wouldn't startle whoever was waiting. The fire crackled low in the stove, giving off a warm orange glow that filled the small cabin with a soft, steady light. The 3 Apache women sat close together near the stove, wrapped in blankets he knew had been on his horse earlier. They had dried their hair and wrung the water from their dresses, though the torn places remained. When they looked up at him, their expressions held exhaustion mixed with cautious hope. Saya stood at once, pulling the blanket higher around her chest. We came because we had nowhere else to go, she said, her voice quiet but steady. We didn't break in. The door was not locked. Grant exhaled slowly, not angered, not surprised, only aware that they had made a choice based on desperation, not convenience. You're safe in here, he said simply. You can stay until you regain strength. The listeners would wonder why they came instead of hiding deeper in the woods, why they didn't run far from the creek, why they trusted a stranger they met half-naked in the water. Saya seemed to recognize those unanswered questions because she stepped closer, her blanket slipping slightly to reveal the torn neckline beneath, and she explained before he had to ask. The men who attacked our camp were not raiders passing through, she said, keeping her eyes on his. They're looking for us. They know these woods. If we hide in the trees, they will find us before morning. Grant understood immediately. skilled hunters, not wanderers, men who tracked with discipline, men who used speed and intimidation to control. Men would not stop because they had taken one sister and likely wanted more. Grant's jaw tightened with a tension he rarely showed. "Why did they raid your camp?" he asked, giving Saya the chance to fill the gap the listeners would demand to understand. She swallowed, then spoke as if the memory had to be forced through her throat. "We refused to move. They wanted our horses. They wanted my sister because she can trade herbs and medicine. They didn't take us because we ran before they saw us clearly." "Where was your camp?" Grant asked. "About 3 miles northeast, near the ridge with the split rock." Her voice grew softer. "We cannot go back." Grant pulled a chair away from the table and motioned for them to sit, though the women stayed near the stove. They watched him with caution, but Saya's gaze held something different now. An evaluation, the kind someone makes when deciding whether a man can be trusted in the long run, not just for one night. "You're hurt," Grant said, noticing the subtle tremor in her arms. "All three of you are." Saya glanced back at the others, then nodded. "We ran without rest." He reached for a small tin box beneath a shelf, setting it on the table without pushing it toward them, making sure they saw he wasn't trying to invade their space. "I have salve and bandages." None of the women moved. Grant waited, letting silence settle in the cabin. He didn't rush them. That patience became the answer they needed. Saya approached first, her steps slow, her blanket shifting just enough to reveal the bruises along her collarbone and the dirty, torn edge of her deerskin top. She sat across from him at the table, holding herself upright the same way she had by the creek. Pride keeping her posture straight, even when fear tugged at her strength. She placed her hand on the table, palm down, showing a scrape across her knuckles. Grant opened the tin and dipped his fingers into the salve, then paused, waiting for her to nod before he touched her. When she gave a small nod, he applied the ointment with steady, careful pressure. Her breathing slowed, not from pain, but from realizing he wasn't trying to claim anything through the gesture. The other two women watched closely, seeing that he wasn't taking advantage of her torn clothing or her exhaustion. "Why didn't you leave us at the creek?" Say asked quietly. Most men would have walked away or tried to make us follow. Grant didn't look up from her hand as he wrapped the cloth around her knuckles. "You look scared." "I don't corner scared people." She studied him for a long moment. "You don't speak much." "Talking hasn't helped me much in the past." That answer held weight. It made her pause. It made the firelight shift across her eyes in a way that told him she understood the shape of a man who survived something heavy. She leaned slightly forward. "What happened to your sister?" The listeners would have asked that by now. They would have wondered why he lived alone, why he carried silence the way he did. Grant kept his movement steady while he replied. "Land dispute," he said. "People acted out of anger. She got caught in it." Saya's breath softened. She didn't offer false comfort. She didn't say she understood. She simply held his gaze, letting the quiet settle in a way that felt heavier than words. "She was young?" Saya asked, voice low. "Too young." Saya nodded once. "I am sorry." He finished wrapping her hand and set the remaining supplies on the table so the other two women could approach if they wished. Saya didn't move away. She stayed seated across from him, blanket slipping enough that the tear in her neckline revealed the curve of her chest again, but Grant didn't change his focus. That steadiness made something unspoken pass between them. Outside, the wind shifted. Someone, or something, moved near the tree line. Grant stood immediately, listening with his head tilted toward the window. The sound wasn't loud, but it wasn't random either. The women froze. Saya rose and stepped closer to him instinctively, the motion quick but not frantic. Grant moved to the window with controlled precision, lifting the curtain just enough to see the darkening yard. The tree lean swayed. A branch bent. He didn't recognize the shape, but he knew it wasn't an animal. He rested one hand near his revolver, but didn't draw it. "They're close," Saya whispered. "Maybe," Grant murmured. "Or maybe it's just the wind." Both knew it wasn't just the wind. Grant lowered the curtain and turned to her. "You can stay here tonight. All of you. Bar the door when I step outside. I'll make sure nothing is creeping too close." Saya reached for his wrist suddenly, stopping him. Her touch was light but firm, her fingers cold from the stove's fading heat. "Don't leave us alone long." Grant nodded once. "I won't." She held his eyes for a moment longer, her breath steady, her chest rising beneath the torn neckline of her dress in a way that showed trust, fear, and something new all at once. When he stepped outside into the cooling evening air, he knew two things with certainty. The men hunting these women were near, and no matter what he had planned for his quiet life, he wasn't walking away from them now. Grant moved into the yard with the same quiet precision he used when tracking strays after sundown, and the air cooled around him in a way that made every distant sound sharper, every shift in the tree line clearer. He kept his breathing steady as he scanned the ground near the cabin, the thin layer of dust on the path catching the last light of dusk. At first he saw nothing unusual, but when he stepped closer to the small row of cottonwoods that bordered the clearing, he noticed a set of impressions, shallow, deliberate, and spaced like someone trying not to be heard. They weren't the women's prints. These were larger, heavier, pointed in different directions, as if the person had paused, watched, and changed course more than once. Inside the cabin, he heard the faint scrape of the door bar, sliding into place, and Saya's low voice instructing the other two women to stay near the stove. Grant didn't turn back to look. He crouched low, fingertips brushing the edges of the tracks. The listeners would have wondered if these belonged to the same men who raided the women's camp. And he knew the truth before he said it aloud. Someone had followed them. He straightened slowly and circled the cabin once, checking each corner with the kind of care that came from years of moving alone in dangerous country. A broken twig lay behind the shed. The fresh split would still clung with sap. Whoever had been here left less than an hour ago. He returned to the door, tapped twice so the women knew it was him, and waited for the bar to be lifted. The door opened just enough for him to step inside, and Saya stood closest to the entrance, her blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders, her hair loose from being hastily braided earlier. Her eyes searched his face before he even spoke. "You found something?" she said quietly. "Footprints," Grant answered. "Someone circled the yard before I came home. They weren't rushing. They were watching." The other two women tightened their grip on the blankets, unease spreading across their faces. The listeners might wonder if Saya recognized the tracking style, if she knew exactly who would trail them this far, and she stepped forward as if answering that silent question. "The men who took my sister are not strangers to this land," she said, voice tense. "They move in small groups, usually 2, sometimes 3. They don't fight loud. They sneak close, then come fast." Grant nodded once. "That matches the tracks." Saya stepped closer to the table, lowering her blanket slightly as she leaned on the edge for support, revealing a fresh bruise along her upper arm that hadn't been visible earlier. Grant noticed, but didn't draw attention to it. Instead, he reached for the water jug, poured a cup, and set it in front of her without a word. "Why are they trailing you so far from your camp?" he asked. Saya accepted the cup, hands trembling from exhaustion rather than fear. "Because they took my sister," she said, voice steady but strained, "and they think we will return for her. They know we won't leave her behind. They expect us to come back." Grant didn't interrupt, letting the truth settle. "They're using her as bait," Saya finished. The cabin went silent except for the popping of the stove. Grant pulled a chair back, sat down slowly, and folded his arms across his chest in a thoughtful, controlled posture. The listeners would want to know how old Saya's sister was, why she was taken instead of the others, and whether she had any way to survive alone. Saya answered those unasked questions without waiting for him to speak. "Her name is Taya," she said. "She is 17. She knows medicine. She knows how to bind wounds and make poultices, and men like the ones who raided our camp, they use healers." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't break. "They took her because she can keep them alive longer. They didn't chase us because they already had what they wanted." Grant leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees. "Why didn't you go for help from your people?" Saya swallowed hard. "Our band scattered days ago. Many ran when trouble started in the neighboring valleys. We don't know where they are now." She hesitated, then added, "And we don't know who to trust anymore." Her answer filled the silent gaps from earlier chapters. The uprooted camp, the missing horses the desperate escape that forced them toward the creek. Grant listened without shifting his gaze. He wasn't judging. He wasn't doubting. He was taking in every detail. The smallest Apache woman approached with cautious steps. "Will they come here?" she asked, her voice trembling. Grant looked at the bar door, then at the window he had checked earlier. "If they saw your tracks leading toward this place," he said carefully, "they might. But they aren't close yet. We have time." Saya studied him with the same sharp attention she had used by the creek, as if trying to understand the kind of man who offered safety to three strangers. "Why are you helping us?" she asked softly. Grant's eyes lowered for a moment. "Because I've seen what happens when people are left alone with danger closing in. I won't let that happen here." His answer made her breathing slow, not from relief, but from recognizing a man who had lost someone and refused to repeat the mistake. The fire dimmed slightly, and Grant stood to add more wood. When he opened the stove door, the light revealed the small interior of the cabin, the stripped-down bed, the single table, the shelves with tools and essentials. The listeners might have wondered how he lived with so little, why he kept no personal items, and Saya noticed the same thing. "You have no family pictures," she said quietly. "I never took any," Grant replied. "No gifts from your sister?" she asked, speaking gently. He hesitated only a moment. They burned in the fire that took her. Saya inhaled sharply, understanding with sudden clarity why he carried silence like armor. She stepped closer, her blanket slipping again at the shoulder, and placed her hand on the table near his. She didn't touch him directly, but the gesture rested between them like something fragile. "You don't have to stand alone with that memory," she said. Grant didn't move for several seconds. Then, without speaking, he placed a small tin cup closer to her hand so she could warm her fingers around it. He couldn't bring himself to take her hand. Not yet. Not tonight. But he didn't step back either. Outside, the wind shifted again. Grant walked to the window and lifted the curtain a fraction. The tree leaves swayed in the dark. A faint rustle broke the quiet. "They're not here yet," he said, "but they're searching." Saya came up beside him, close enough that her shoulder brushed his arm. "What will we do?" Grant turned slightly toward her. The firelight caught the side of her face, the curve of her cheek, the torn edge of her dress, and the fierce determination beneath her exhaustion. "Tomorrow," he said, voice steady, "we go find your sister." Saya's breath hitched, not from fear, but from hearing a promise she hadn't expected a stranger to make. "And tonight?" she asked. "Tonight," Grant said, lowering the curtain. "You all stay inside the cabin, and I'll keep watch." She stepped closer, her hand lifting almost unconsciously, her fingertips brushing the back of his wrist in a brief, trembling touch. Her voice dropped to a quiet confession. "I trust you." Grant didn't speak. He didn't pull away. He just let the moment settle between them, the start of something neither of them would admit aloud. Not yet, not here, but both felt in the slow, steady rise of their breaths. The night pressed in around the cabin, and Grant positioned himself near the door, knowing full well that by morning nothing about his life would look the same again. Grant stayed by the door with his back straight and his eyes fixed on the window nearest the tree lean, listening to the dark settle across the yard the way it always did on long nights. But this time the silence carried a tension he hadn't felt in years. He could sense movement out there, small shifts in the branches, a faint scrape of something pushing through brush, but nothing came close enough to show itself. Inside the cabin, the three women slept near the stove, wrapped tightly in blankets, their breathing soft and uneven from exhaustion. Saya lay closest to the fire, one arm tucked under her head, her torn dress partially hidden beneath the blanket. Her hair had dried in loose waves, framing her face in a way that made her look younger and more vulnerable than she had appeared earlier. Grant turned away from the window for a moment to check on them, and he noticed the listeners would wonder why he didn't try to send them deeper into the canyon or toward the nearby trading post for safety. He hadn't explained that the trading post had closed after a robbery earlier that spring, or that the nearby settlers didn't welcome Apache visitors. He added that missing piece now by thinking through the situation with careful logic. "There's no safe place to send you," he said quietly. more to himself than to them. The ridge is too open, and the town's too far. We handle this here. He spoke in a low voice not meant to wake them, but Saya stirred anyway, shifting under the blanket. She rose halfway, the fabric slipping from her shoulder to reveal the curve of her collarbone and the edge of the torn neckline. She didn't pull the blanket up right away. She simply watched him with tired eyes. "You haven't slept?" she whispered. "I'm fine," he replied. She sat fully upright, her hair falling over one shoulder. "You don't have to keep watch alone. You need rest for tomorrow," he said, his tone firm but gentle. "I need you steady when we start looking for your sister." That reminder steadied her posture, and she pulled the blanket closer around herself. She rose slowly and walked to the small table, her bare feet making almost no sound across the wooden floor. Grant followed her with his eyes, but didn't move, knowing she wasn't approaching him to change his mind. She simply needed to stand, to feel like she wasn't hiding. Saya looked around the cabin, taking in details the listeners would have been curious about earlier. Tools hung on hooks above the stove, an old coat folded neatly over the back of a chair, and a small carved wooden horse placed on a high shelf. She stepped closer to the carving. "This belonged to your sister?" she asked. Grant nodded. "I kept it because she made it for me." "You said the fire took her things," Saya added softly. "It took most of them," he said. "Not that." Her fingers hovered close to the carving without touching it, as if she didn't want to disturb something that mattered. "She must have loved you." Grant's jaw tightened in a subtle, familiar way. "She was bright. Too kind for the world we lived in." Saya lowered her hand and turned toward him, the blanket shifting again with her movement. She studied him with the same sharp awareness she had shown at the creek. "You carry her memory like a weight that never leaves your shoulders." "I carry it because no one else will," he said. Before Saya could answer, a soft thud sounded outside, muted quick like a boot hitting dirt with controlled pressure. Grant's posture changed instantly, and he stepped toward the window without hesitation. Saya moved behind him, not out of fear but to see what he sensed. Grant lifted the curtain just enough to create a narrow line of sight. A shadow shifted between the trees, tall enough to be a man, broad enough to be someone who knew how to move silently. He didn't walk straight to the cabin. He moved sideways, tracing an arc around the clearing, searching for a vantage point. "There's someone out there," Grant said quietly. Saya's breath caught. "Is it one of them?" "Could be," he said. "He's alone for now." The listeners might question why one man would scout alone, why he wouldn't bring more to attack immediately. Grant understood the tactic and voiced it so the women and the audience would understand. "He's checking the place before the others move in," Grant murmured. "Trying to see if you're inside." Saya stepped closer, her shoulder brushing his arm. "Will he come to the door?" "No," Grant said. "Not yet. He's waiting for darkness to get deeper." Grant moved away from the window and reached for his coat, sliding into it with slow, silent motions. Saya watched with a tight expression, her hands clutching the blanket at her chest. "You're going outside again," she said, hearing the decision before he spoke it. "He needs to know this place isn't an easy mark," Grant replied. "You'll be walking into danger," she said, voice trembling despite her effort to keep steady. "If he's one of them, he won't fight fair." Grant turned toward her. "I'm not planning to fight. I just want him off the property." Saya closed the distance between them. The blanket slipped slightly, exposing more of her torn neckline, but she seemed unaware of it. Her eyes held an urgency that wasn't fear of the man outside, but fear of losing the one person who had offered protection without force. "If something happens to you," she said quietly, "we won't survive." Grant held her gaze. "Nothing is going to happen to me." She reached for his wrist again, her fingertips cool against his skin, her grip firmer than before. The contact grounded them both. She didn't release him until she knew he wasn't changing his mind. "Come back," she whispered. "I will," he said. He stepped outside once more, closing the door without a sound. The women barred it from within, and Saya stood frozen behind it, listening for movement in the yard. Grant moved toward the shadowed tree-line, each step measured. The man hidden between the trees shifted again, a slower movement this time, as if he had finally noticed Grant's approach. Grant stopped at the edge of the yard, hands open at his sides, letting the stranger know he wasn't sneaking. The man stayed still, but Grant's voice reached him anyway. "You've seen enough," he said into the darkness. "You come closer, you answer to me." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a silhouette eased backward into the deeper dark, moving silently the way trained men move when they know they've been spotted. Grant waited until the shape disappeared completely. When he returned to the cabin, Saya lifted the bar before he could knock. She pulled the door open, stepping back with visible relief when she saw him unharmed. The other two women exhaled at the same time. "He's gone," Grant said, "but he'll be back. With more." Saya stepped close, her blanket falling slightly as she reached for his arm to steady herself. Not from fear, but from the knowledge that tomorrow would change everything. Grant looked at all three women, then back at Saya. "We leave at first light," he said. "We find your sister before they use her to find you." Saya nodded slowly, her eyes holding his with a trust that hadn't existed a day ago. And for the first time since his sister died, Grant felt the unfamiliar pull of belonging forming in the small cabin that had always been empty until tonight. Dawn broke in a pale, muted line across the foothills, the kind that arrived without warmth, turning the grass silver before any real light reached the ground. Grant stepped outside before the sun fully cleared the ridge, his boots landing quietly in the cool dirt. He scanned the tree line with the same precision he used the night before. Nothing moved. No shadows shifted. No branches bent under hidden weight. Whoever had scouted the cabin had pulled back far enough to wait for reinforcements. Inside, the soft shuffle of movement told him the women were waking. He stepped back in the cabin and found Saya helping the others fold their blankets. Her hair was tied loosely over one shoulder, strands falling across her cheek in a way that looked unplanned. The torn neckline of her dress had dried overnight, the rip clearer now, revealing the strong curve of her chest before disappearing into the rough leather. She caught him looking, not at her chest, but at the bruising on her upper arm she had tried to hide earlier. She lowered her gaze, then lifted it again, as if reminding herself she didn't need to hide anything here. "We move now?" she asked. Grant nodded. "Before they come back." The smallest woman, the one who had barely spoken, lifted her chin. "How far is the split rock from here?" "A little over 3 miles, Grant said. "But getting close without being seen will be harder than the walk." Saya stepped closer to him. "They keep Taya near the canyon or deeper in the shelters?" "We'll find out," he replied. The listeners would wonder whether Grant had ever tracked dangerous men before, whether he understood how to approach a camp that didn't want to be found. He added the missing clarity now. "I worked with a territorial scout when I was young," he said. "He taught me how to read a camp before stepping into it." Saya studied him quietly. "You've seen men like them." "I have," Grant answered, "and I know how they think." He packed supplies into a small canvas sack: bread, a tin water flask, bandage strips, and a small hunting knife he rarely used because he preferred his revolver locked in its holster unless absolutely necessary. The women prepared themselves, tightening belts around their dresses, smoothing their hair, and adjusting the small pouches tied to their waists. Saya slipped a bone-handled knife into the side of her dress. Grant hadn't seen it before. "You had that yesterday?" he asked. "I hid it in the creek stones when we went in the water," she said. "I didn't want you to think we meant harm." Grant nodded once. "Good. Keep it close." Before they stepped outside, Saya paused, facing him directly. "You said he'll return with more men," she said quietly. "How many do you expect?" 4 or 5, Grant replied. "They'll leave one behind to watch your tracks. The rest will move fast." She nodded, steadying herself with a slow exhale. "We'll be faster." Grant opened the door, letting them out one by one. The morning air was crisp, and the forest carried the damp scent of night. He motioned for them to stay close as they crossed the yard, and Saya walked beside him with focused silence. The other women followed, just behind, scanning the shadows the way someone does when danger has shaped their instincts. Once they reached the creek trail, Grant crouched low near the bank. Fresh impressions appeared in the mud, print from the night before, but deeper now, meaning the scout had stayed longer than he originally thought. Saya knelt beside him. "How close did he come?" Grant pointed to a footprint angled toward the cabin, close enough to see inside if he wanted. But he didn't. Why? He was gathering information, not attacking. Saya swallowed. Then they know we're here. They suspect, Grant corrected softly. Not know. The listeners might ask why these men had not struck already, why they didn't storm the cabin in the night. Grant could see the answer clearly. They want Taya to draw you out, he said. If you vanish, they lose their advantage. So they wait until they think you're coming to them. Saya closed her eyes briefly, understanding. So we strike first. Grant stood and adjusted the strap on his saddlebag. Exactly. The four of them traveled along the creek, staying in the shadow of the tall pines. The ground rose slowly as they approached the higher ridge. Through the trees, the sun broke in thin streaks, illuminating patches of land before slipping behind trunks again. Saya moved with surprising steadiness despite exhaustion. The torn leather of her dress made her steps careful, but her posture never faltered. Halfway up the ridge, Grant raised his hand, signaling them to stop. He scanned the ground. Here, the prints changed, lighter impressions, more deliberate, spaced wider. Someone had moved through at a controlled pace, meaning they weren't rushing. They were tracking. These aren't from the women, Grant said, and not from last night. Saya crouched beside him. More than one. Two, he confirmed. Maybe three. The smallest of the women asked quietly, Are they close? Grant shook his head. They passed through before sunrise. They headed toward the split rock. A long, steady quiet followed. The women exchanged looks, fear mixed with urgency, and the listeners would wonder if they ever considered turning back, whether caution outweighed desperation. Saya answered the unspoken question by stepping forward. We go, she said. Grant moved ahead of them, guiding their steps up a narrow incline until the trees opened into a sparse clearing where the wind carried more sound. From here, the split rock formation was visible, two large stone slabs rising from the ground with a gap wide enough for two people to slip through. Beyond that gap, a long stretch of wooded ground led toward a natural ravine where camps could be hidden from sight. Saya stepped beside him, her voice a whisper. They're keeping her in there. We can't go in blind, Grant said. We need to see the layout. The listeners would want to understand how Grant planned to handle a camp likely filled with armed raiders, what strategy he intended to use, what he knew about the terrain. He studied the land, noting the angle of the rocks, the possible hiding spots, and the lines of sight. They'll post one guard near the entrance, he said. Another deeper in. The leader will stay close to Taya. Saya's jaw tightened. How do you know that? Because that's how I would do it if I didn't want anyone getting in or out. She looked at him with something deeper than trust, something like realizing he had stepped into their fight without hesitation. What do you need us to do? She asked. Grant pointed to a fallen pine near the ridge. Stay behind that until I signal. No one moves until I'm sure how many are inside. Saya didn't argue. She motioned for the other women to follow her toward the tree. Before she ducked behind the fallen trunk, she returned to Grant, leaning closer than she ever had before. Her voice was quiet, but her breath trembled. Don't leave me behind, she said. I won't, Grant replied. She pressed her fingers lightly against his arm, not gripping, just touching the same way she had done the night before. The contact lasted only a moment, but it steadied both of them. Grant stepped forward into the narrow gap between the rocks, the cold air inside brushing against his skin. He listened for movement beyond the canyon turn, hearing the faint clatter of metal and a low voice carried by the wind. The raiders were here, and Taya was still alive. Grant tightened his jaw, placed one hand on his revolver, not drawing it, just resting there, and stepped deeper into the shadows of the ravine, knowing the next few minutes would decide the fate of all four women, and that whatever waited inside, he wasn't walking away without Saya's sister. Grant slipped into the narrow throat of the ravine with slow, measured steps, the rock walls rising on both sides and uneven slabs that funneled sound in a way that made even the softest footfall echo faintly. The air cooled sharply as he moved deeper, carrying the earthy scent of damp stone and old leaves. He lifted his gaze just enough to catch the faint reflection of morning light off something metallic ahead, too low to be the sky, too still to be an animal. A weapon, held by someone standing guard. He eased behind a jagged boulder, keeping his breathing shallow. From here, the listeners would want to know exactly how many men were inside, what weapons they carried, and whether Taya was still in a condition to move. Grant focused on gathering those answers without stepping into a trap. He leaned slightly to the side, enough to see the guard through a sliver of rock. The man stood with his back to the deeper canyon, rifle resting near his hip, posture bored rather than alert. That told Grant something important. The scout from last night hadn't reported seeing anyone at the cabin. Otherwise, this guard would be on edge. He crept closer, boots rolling heel to toe on the uneven ground, every movement deliberate. When he was within reach of a low ridge, he crouched again. A faint voice carried through the narrow corridor, too soft to make out at first. He moved a fraction closer, and the voices sharpened. "She's not going anywhere," one man said with a rough laugh. "She's too scared to step outside the tent." "She better start working," another answered. "Leader wants those herbs ready." Grant's jaw hardened. They hadn't taken Taya as bait alone. They needed her knowledge of medicine. That meant she was alive, but likely tired, hungry, and frightened. The guard shifted, scratching his neck as he turned slightly. Grant took that moment to slip to the opposite rock wall, moving with a calm speed that brought him within 10 feet of the man. The listeners might have wondered why he hadn't drawn his revolver yet, whether his hesitation risked everything. Grant didn't pull the gun because gunfire would echo through the ravine and draw every raider instantly. He needed silence. He reached the guard in 3 steady steps, grabbed the man's collar, and slammed him sideways into the rock with force just strong enough to drop him. The man collapsed in a heavy slump, his rifle clattering softly against the dirt. Grant dragged him behind a fallen log and pressed 2 fingers to his neck. The man was unconscious, not dead. Grant whispered under his breath, "One down." He moved forward until he reached a bend in the ravine that widened into a hidden clearing flanked by tall stone pillars. Several makeshift tents stood near the center, made from canvas and patched hides. Smoke drifted thinly from a small fire. Grant crouched lower, scanning. 2 men sat nearby, one sharpening a blade, the other stirring something in a tin cup. Then he saw her. Taya sat beside a fallen trunk near the rear tent, her wrists bound loosely with rope, her head tilted down as she sorted herbs into small piles. She had long black hair like Saya, though hers was tangled from struggle. A bruise darkened her cheek, but her breathing looked steady. She wasn't broken. She wasn't defeated. Grant felt the briefest tightening in his chest. He hadn't known her before this, but she mattered because Saya needed her alive. He motioned for Saya and the other women to remain behind the fallen pine while he assessed the situation. But Saya, hidden far behind him, couldn't see what he saw. She only had Grant's promise and the silence that followed to rely on. The listeners might wonder if Grant had a clear plan or if he was moving purely on instinct now. He clarified his thinking internally as he studied the layout. There were 3 men in camp, not counting the scout he had seen last night. The leader sat on a crate, cleaning a revolver with slow, thoughtful movements. The last man watched Taya but didn't bother tying her legs, which meant they didn't think she was brave enough to try escape. Grant tightened his grip on a knife at his side. He stepped back into the shadowed part of the ravine and signaled quietly, a low whistle, pitched high enough that only someone listening for him would notice. Saya responded with a soft tapping against the fallen pine. 1 tap. Ready. Grant turned the corner again, and this time his movements carried a precision that belonged to the man he once was before his sister's death. The man who learned to track, who learned to read danger, who learned to strike fast. He approached the clearing from the side where the tall stone pillar created a blind spot. When the man sharpening his blade stretched his arms up with a groan, Grant moved. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisted hard enough to disarm him, then knocked him unconscious with a quick strike to the jaw. The other raider turned, reaching for his rifle, but Grant lunged forward and tackled him, pinning him to the ground with a firm, controlled hold before delivering a quick blow that ended his resistance. Only 1 man remained, the leader. He stood slowly, recognizing the sound of struggle, even though he couldn't see the details. His eyes narrowed, fingers tightening around his revolver. "Come out," the leader called. "You've already made a mistake stepping in here." Grant didn't answer. The listeners might wonder if Grant hesitated because he didn't want to kill anyone, or if he feared the man would use Taya as leverage. Grant closed the distance with quiet steps, aware the leader was turning in slow circles, trying to pinpoint him by sound alone. When the leader stepped closer to Taya, raising his gun toward her, Grant moved swiftly. He slammed the man's arm upward, sending the bullet into the air instead of toward Taya. The shot cracked through the ravine, echoing in sharp waves. Grant felt the recoil hit his chest as he grabbed the man's wrist and twisted it away. The revolver dropped to the dirt, and Grant shoved the man into a rock face, knocking the fight out of him in an instant. He collapsed in a stunned heap. Taya stared up at Grant, chest rising quickly, her voice catching. "You're not with them." "No," Grant said. "Your sister sent me." Taya's eyes widened. "Saya's alive?" "She is," he said, and waiting, before she could ask anything else, he cut the rope around her wrist with the knife he carried. She stood slowly, leaning against the rock as she steadied herself. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded, though her legs trembled from hunger and shock. Grant supported her with one hand at her waist, guiding her toward the ravine entrance. "Where are the others?" she whispered. "Behind the fallen pine," Grant answered. "They'll meet us when it's safe." When they emerged from the ravine, Saya broke from the cover before Grant could signal. She sprinted toward them, her blanket falling away from her shoulders as she grabbed her sister and pulled her close, their foreheads pressing together in a long, overdue connection. The other two women joined, touching Taya's arms and hair with relief. Grant stepped back a few paces, giving them space. He watched quietly, the edges of his breath easing as he witnessed something he hadn't seen in years, a family reunited, even if shaken. Then Saya turned to him. Her eyes filled not with tears, but with something steadier. "You brought her back to me," she said. Grant nodded. "We're not out of danger yet. The shot will bring the others." Saya stepped closer, close enough that her chest brushed against his arm as she steadied her breathing. Her voice lowered. "We'll face them together." Grant looked at all four women. "Then we move fast." Taya held Saya's hand as they followed Grant into the forest away from the ravine, leaving the camp behind just as the sound of distant voices began rising through the trees. The hunters were coming, and Grant McCallan was done being the man who walked away. Grant led them away from the ravine with a pace that balanced urgency and silence. His steps angled toward the thicker part of the woods where the pine trunks grew close enough to break the line of sight from anyone following. The forest floor sloped downward into a shallow basin filled with old fallen needles, and each step sank just enough to soften their sound. Saya kept her hand on Taya's wrist, guiding her over roots and rocks, refusing to let her fall behind. The other two women followed tightly behind Grant, glancing back every few seconds as distant shouts began to echo through the ravine. The raiders had found their men, those knocked unconscious, and the sound of angry commands rose like a warning carried on the wind. Grant paused at the edge of a small clearing marked by a thin trail of flattened grass. It wasn't wide enough to be a common path. It was narrow, winding, almost hidden unless someone knew what to look for. "This way," he said, shifting his weight as he crouched and inspected the ground. Saya frowned softly. "Where does it go?" "Old game trail," Grant replied. "Deer used it long before I came here. Men passing through these woods don't know it exists unless they stop to study the ground." The listeners would have wondered how Grant knew about it so well, and he answered the unspoken curiosity with a quiet explanation. "When I first bought my land," he said, "I tracked a stray calf into these woods. Found this trail by accident. It saved me when a cougar circled too close." Saya's expression changed with that detail. Part interest, part respect, part realization that Grant had faced danger alone long before she ever crossed his path. Grant moved forward again, guiding them into the narrow, winding trail where the low branches forced them to duck slightly. The overgrowth shielded them from anyone trying to track them quickly. But the distant voices grew louder, more determined, and Taya tightened her grip on Saya's hand. "They're hunting us," Taya whispered. They're following the path we took out of the canyon, Grant said. Not this one. They'll notice the missing men, Saya said. They already did, Grant answered. But it takes time for anger to turn into tracking. We use that time. Saya nodded, though her breath trembled. She hadn't slept, hadn't eaten properly, and still she held herself upright with a force that made her look stronger than anyone Grant had known in years. As they moved deeper into the trail, Grant noticed something else that needed addressing. The listeners would wonder how many raiders remained, how organized they were, and whether their leader had survived the blow. Grant had counted 3 inside the ravine, 1 outside scouting earlier, and he suspected at least 2 more in the woods. That meant 6 total, with possibly 5 still capable of chasing them. They won't give up easily, Grant said, keeping his voice steady. Their leader will still be breathing. I didn't hit him hard enough to lose him for long. Saya stepped closer to him, brushing a branch aside. Why didn't you finish him? Because it wasn't the right time, Grant said. He fired the gun. The sound already put us at a disadvantage. If I killed him, we'd have had a dead man's blood on our hands on top of the noise. This way, confusion slows them down. Saya processed that with a look that wasn't admiration, but something deeper, an understanding of the careful thought behind every one of his movements. They reached a point where the trail branched in 2 directions, one leading toward a steep rocky incline, the other dipping into a small glen filled with ferns and wild grass. Grant crouched to examine the ground again, running his fingers along the bent stems. We go right, he decided. The left slope gives too much noise if you slip. Taya leaned forward. How far until your cabin? Less than 2 miles, Grant said. But we can't walk straight there. We have to curve wide, so anyone trailing your footprints loses direction. The smallest Apache woman hesitated. If they find a cabin, I'll handle it, Grant said with quiet certainty. But we need to get you 4 safe and hidden first. The group pushed deeper into the shadows. Grant kept them under thick branches whenever the wind shifted. He could read the forest the way other men read maps, and his calm control settled the rising panic inside the group. But the women's fatigue grew more obvious. Taya stumbled once, her legs giving briefly from weakness. Saya caught her, holding her upright with a firm arm around her waist. Grant stopped instantly and returned to them. We rest for 1 minute. Saya shook her head. They're close. 1 minute, he repeated. Strength matters more than speed. He helped Taya sit against a fallen log, handing her a strip of dried bread from his bag. She ate slowly, chewing with difficulty, but each bite steadied her. The listeners might wonder why Grant didn't carry her, why he didn't push harder despite danger. He addressed that with his actions. He knelt beside Taya and checked her breathing, her pulse, the clarity in her eyes. You can walk, he said gently, but tell me the second your legs fail. I'll carry you then. Not before. You need to keep your own weight as long as you can. Taya nodded, grateful he treated her like someone capable, not a burden. Saya placed a hand on Grant's shoulder briefly, her touch soft but firm. You know how to lead people, she whispered. Grant looked at her with a calm tension. I know how to get people out alive. The moment lingered between them until a faint snap of a twig snapped the quiet apart. Grant rose in one swift movement, his hand resting over his revolver but not drawing it. He motioned for silence. The women pressed closer together. A distant voice floated through the trees, low, angry, searching. They couldn't have gone far. Grant's eyes sharpened. The raiders were spreading out. He guided the women further along the trail, moving at a quicker pace now that they were regaining strength. The brush thickened ahead until sunlight barely reached the ground. They squeezed through tight clusters of branches, each step controlled. Finally, Grant saw it, the small ridge that curved toward a hidden hollow behind a fallen boulder. A place few people knew existed. A place he had used once before when avoiding a debt collector after his sister's death. This way, he said, no one will find you here. He led them behind a massive boulder where the earth dipped into a quiet hollow large enough for the 4 women to crouch, but sheltered from view in every direction. Saya looked uncertain. What about you? I'll lay a false trail, Grant said. Draw them south, then double back. Taya grabbed his sleeve suddenly. If they catch you, "They won't," Grant said with steady calm. Saya stepped close, her chest rising beneath the torn leather of her dress, her breath brushing his collarbone as she looked up at him. "Come back," she whispered. "If you don't return, everything we've gained today disappears." Grant let that plea settle inside him, more powerful than any he'd heard in years. He cupped her elbow briefly, his first intentional touch, his thumb brushing her skin with a careful steadiness. "I'll return," he said. No promise had ever felt heavier or more honest. He stepped away from the hollow, moving toward the open forest to create the trail that would lead the raiders far from the women. And behind him, hidden in the shadows, Saya watched him go with a mix of fear, trust, and something deeper beginning to take shape, something neither of them had dared name yet. Grant McCallan disappeared into the trees, and the forest held its breath. Grant moved into the thicker part of the forest with a fast, controlled stride, the kind that left a clear enough trail to draw men in, but subtle enough to convince them it hadn't been made on purpose. He snapped a few branches low to the ground, dragged the heel of his boot through patches of loose soil, and kicked pine needles aside in a way that mimicked panic rather than strategy. The raiders were close enough that their voices carried through the trees. Short commands, frustrated muttering, and the unmistakable sound of rifles brushing against brush as they pushed forward. He kept his breathing steady as he curved his path south, leaving the women hidden behind the boulder's shadow. Every decision had to be exact. Too clean a trail, and the raiders would sense a trick. Too messy, and they might stop to reassess, doubling back before he bought enough time. The listeners might wonder whether Grant had ever performed something this risky before, and the truth settled quietly in his mind as he moved. He had done similar work once, years ago, when protecting a neighbor's boy from a violent land baron, slipping through the woods to draw danger away. But back then, he had only been responsible for one life. Now he guarded four. He stopped near a down tree and crouched to inspect a patch of moss. Fresh leaves had fallen from branches above, small ones disturbed by motion. Someone had passed through here just minutes earlier. Grant knelt lower, listening. A faint crunch echoed to his left, another to his right. They weren't splitting up, they were encircling. "They're moving fast," he whispered to himself, and the realization tightened something inside him. He broke into a quicker pace, but kept it quiet, sliding between brush and weaving through narrow paths only someone with long familiarity with the terrain could navigate. He reached a small ridge he'd used once before as a lookout point. From there, he saw them. 5 figures pushing through the trees, 2 scanning the ground for prints, the others watching the forest edges. They were armed, tired but determined. One raider lifted his head. "Tracks curve south." Another cursed. "He's leading us away. The women might be doubling back. Then we catch him first." The leader barked, still furious from the blow Grant had dealt him earlier. Their pace increased. Grant had succeeded. He had their full attention. But he hadn't bought nearly enough time. He moved fast toward the creek bed, planning to use the water to mask his trail. He slid down the bank and stepped into the shallow stream, the cold water pushing against his boots as he hurried along the narrow channel. He walked for 20 yards, then stepped onto a patch of thick moss to avoid leaving prints. The forest ahead ballooned outward into a small clearing filled with sunlight. He stayed low, listening again. The woods behind him erupted with movement. The raiders had found the creek. He went through here. "Fan out." Grant ducked behind a cluster of ferns, body still, breath slow. For a moment, he couldn't see them, but he could hear them, cloth brushing against branches, the faint click of rifle bolts, a heavy footstep on stone. The listeners would question whether Grant feared being caught, whether he ever hesitated to risk his life for strangers. But the truth was plain. Fear didn't dictate his steps. What held him still was calculation, not panic. He waited until 2 men passed by his hiding place, their eyes fixed on the stream ahead. The leader lingered behind them, slower than the rest, scanning the area with suspicion. He saw the faint moss crushed by Grant's boots and froze. Grant stayed motionless, knowing the next choice meant everything. The leader took one more step toward Grant's hiding place. Grant burst from the ferns, hitting the man hard enough to knock him sideways. They both slammed into the dirt, the raider swinging wildly with his rifle while Grant pinned his arm. The rifle discharged into the air, sending a sharp crack through the woods. Birds exploded from branches overhead. The other raiders spun toward the noise instantly. Grant stunned the leader with a solid strike to the jaw, but the man twisted, grabbing Grant's coat as he fell. Grant tore free and bolted into the deeper woods, weaving through trees with long, powerful strides. He didn't need to outrun them forever, just long enough to mislead them. The raiders followed, yelling orders, struggling to keep up, crashing through brush that Grant avoided with ease. He cut left, then right, doubling back just enough to confuse direction. He slipped down a rocky slope and paused behind a stump to listen. The chase was splitting. They went north, no south. The trail curves. Grant allowed himself a measure of breath. The confusion would give him the final window he needed. But the listeners might question whether he had a clear way back to the women. He considered this quickly. He couldn't retrace his path. The men were scattered everywhere. So he veered toward the ridge that overlooked the hollow. It was higher, steeper, but safer if he timed it right. He climbed the ridge with controlled urgency, gripping rocks and pulling himself upward. When he reached the top, he crouched low and scanned the forest below. From here, he could see everything. The narrow hollow where the women waited, the sweep of trees beyond, and the raiders scrambling in the wrong direction. He had bought enough time. Grant descended the ridge from the far side, circling back toward the boulder without leaving a clear pattern. When he reached the hollow, the women were exactly where he left them, pressed into the shadows. Saya was standing while the others crouched, her eyes locked on the forest, as if she had been listening to every distant sound. When Grant stepped into view, Saya ran to him. Not recklessly, not blindly, but with a relieved urgency she couldn't hide. Her hands landed on his shoulders first, her breath catching as she scanned him for injuries. "You're back," she whispered. "I said I would," Grant answered, voice rough from exertion but steady. Saya cupped his face for a brief moment, her thumb brushing the dirt on his cheek. It wasn't romantic or calculated. It was the kind of touch someone gives when they're checking to see if a person is still alive. Then she pulled her hand away, her breathing settling as the weight lifted from her shoulders. Taya stepped forward, trembling slightly. "Did they see you?" "They saw a path," Grant said. "Not where it leads." Saya exhaled sharply. "So they're chasing the wrong direction." "For now," Grant replied. "We have to move before they close the gap again." The smallest woman asked the question hanging unspoken in the air. "Where can we go that they won't track?" Grant looked toward the distant tree line, his voice firm. "There's a back route to my cabin. They don't know it exists. We follow that, and by the time they realize their mistake, we'll be long gone." Saya reached for Grant's wrist, her grip steady, trusting. He didn't pull away. "Lead us," she said. Grant nodded, and the five of them slipped into the woods as the raiders' voices faded in the opposite direction, unaware they had already lost the trail. But the day wasn't over, and danger wasn't done with them yet. Grant led them through the hidden route with unwavering focus, cutting between clusters of brush where the ground dipped and rose in small curves that disguised their movement. The forest shifted from dense pines to thinner groves of aspen, their pale trunks catching the late-day light in narrow beams. The women followed in a tight line, each step careful, their exhaustion clear, but their resolve stronger than the morning before. Saya stayed close to Grant, occasionally glancing back for Taya, making sure her sister didn't stumble. The listeners might wonder whether the raiders kept searching after losing the trail, and Grant answered that concern by scanning the hilltops every few minutes. "They're still pushing south," he murmured when he caught distant movement far beyond the ridge. "They haven't realized their mistake." "Will they stop?" Taya asked softly. "They'll break apart by nightfall," Grant said. "Hunters lose conviction when the woods turn cold." Saya watched him with a quiet intensity, her gratitude visible in her posture rather than her expression. She stepped closer as they moved, brushing a low branch aside before it could strike his face. A small gesture, done instinctively. Grant noticed, but he didn't comment. By the time they neared the final stretch leading to his cabin, The sun had dipped behind the western ridge, leaving the sky washed in faint gold. Grant slowed his pace. The women needed rest, but they also needed to know they were safe. He motioned for them to circle near an old stump where the trees parted enough to see the clearing ahead. There, he said quietly. The cabin stood still and untouched, framed by the last streak of orange light. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney, meaning no one had approached while they were gone. Grant studied the ground around the yard. No fresh depressions, no bent grass, no broken twigs. The silence here was honest. "It's safe," he said. Saya let out a long breath she'd been holding since sunrise. She looked back at her sister, touching her arm gently, as though confirming reality. Taya stepped forward, eyes soft with relief. "You kept your promise," Taya whispered to Grant. He nodded once. "Let's get inside." They crossed the clearing together, and when the women stepped into the familiar warmth of the cabin, they moved with the heavy, unsteady steps of people who had been pushed beyond their limits, but finally allowed to stop. Grant closed the door and slid the bar into place. The sound echoed with quiet assurance. No more chase. No more running. The listeners might wonder what happened next, where the women would go, how they would survive, whether Saya intended to leave once Taya recovered. Those questions settled in the room like dust until Saya faced Grant directly. "What will happen now?" she asked, her voice steady but weighted with uncertainty. Grant put away his revolver on the shelf, the gesture slow and calm. "You can stay here until you decide your next path," he said. "No one will force you to move before you're ready." Saya stepped closer. "Do you expect us to leave soon?" "No," he said, meeting her eyes with a quiet honesty. "I expect you to heal. The rest is your choice." Taya sank onto the bench near the table, rubbing her wrists where the ropes had been. The smallest Apache woman knelt by the stove, feeding thin wood into the fire. The shifting flames added a warm orange glow to the room, softening the rigid corners of Grant's posture. Saya walked toward him slowly, stopping when they were close enough for her breath to brush his shirt. "You risked everything for us," she said. "You didn't need to do that." Grant held her gaze. "I wouldn't have done it if I didn't think it mattered." Saya's eyes softened, and she reached up to touch his cheek. The first time she initiated contact with clear intent rather than fear. Her fingertips were warm now, no longer shaking from shock. Grant didn't pull back. He let her touch settle, grounding him in a way he had never expected to feel again. Taya watched quietly from the table, understanding before anyone spoke that her sister's path had shifted the moment Grant found them by the creek. Saya lowered her hand slowly. "Grant, what do you see for yourself now?" He hesitated, not out of doubt, but because the question had not crossed his mind in years. "I see a home that hasn't felt alive in a long time," he said, "and I see people in it who deserve peace." Saya stepped closer, close enough that her torn neckline brushed lightly against his chest as she breathed. She hadn't been shy about her body since leaving the ravine. The danger had stripped away her self-consciousness. But this moment wasn't about fear or injury. It was about choice. Her voice dropped to a softer, steadier tone. "And do we belong in that home?" she asked. Grant answered without hesitation. "If you choose to." The smallest of the women approached timidly. "If we stay, will the raiders return?" "No," Grant said. "They'll search the ravine and the southern woods until they tire. By tomorrow morning, they'll assume you escaped north and crossed into tribal land." Taya lifted her head. "We could leave. Find our people again." "You could," Grant said gently, "or you could rest here first." Saya reached for Grant's hand this time, slowly threading her fingers with his. The gesture surprised even her, but she didn't pull back. He tightened his grip in return, not claiming her, matching her choice. She breathed in slowly. "I don't want to leave." Grant's throat tightened in a way he hadn't felt since before tragedy had reshaped his world. "Then don't," he said. The stove crackled softly. The women settled onto blankets near the hearth. Grant and Saya remained standing for a moment longer, holding each other's hands in the quiet. Saya stepped closer, lifting her face just enough that her lips brushed his jaw first, then the corner of his mouth. The kiss was slow, careful, unhurried. Two people grounding themselves after surviving something that nearly broke them both. Grant rested one hand on her waist, steady and warm, anchoring her. When they parted, she leaned her forehead against his. "You found us in the water," she murmured, "and you gave us a place to live. You found your way here," Grant said. "I'm just glad I was there when you needed someone." She smiled, faint and real. "We need you still." Grant held her a little closer, feeling the truth of that settle deep inside him. That night, the cabin remained warm and calm. The women slept safely for the first time in days. Grant and Saya shared quiet conversation near the window, speaking softly about what they might do after rebuilding strength, perhaps repairing the broken fences together, sharing the land, letting Taya gather herbs safely, and letting life settle into something steady. No questions lingered. No danger threatened. No uncertainty remained. By dawn, the future was clear. Saya and her sisters chose to stay. Grant chose to let his heart open again. And for the first time since tragedy stole his family, Grant McCallan no longer faced the world alone.